what we'd like to do here is begin to unpack this challenge a bit more. So what we've done in the first couple of exercises of this session is to effectively take some digital techniques, but to apply them to stakeholder situations. And the reason why we're doing this one first to kick off with is that I think when you're dealing with a group of perhaps particularly challenging stakeholders, I know from my own experience that it can feel really overwhelming and perhaps quite difficult. And then trying to break it down into these individual elements can be a really good way to begin to define the problem. So firstly, getting a sense of which stakeholders are involved and what we know about their current priorities. So perhaps if you're getting short shrift from trustees at the moment about investment, what's going on there? Is it to do with money just being tight generally? Is it to do with them not understanding what's critical to invest in digital? I think just beginning to think more about what those underlying motivations can be quite a good way in. Understanding what the challenge is. So is this about a new project? Is this about perhaps people thinking, oh, these things are going to be especially challenging? They're worried about how they're going to manage the time in this. So thinking about what is the nature of these pain points ahead, whether they're real or whether they're assumed. And what I think can also be quite useful is to consider where is this tension flaring up a bit. So it might be in meetings, it might be perhaps in direct messaging, wherever it is, to think about where's this really manifesting itself, so you can begin to think about what can I do to influence these situations. And then finally, bringing this back to why is this a problem really worth solving? If we can make progress on this, if we can bring the stakeholder around, what is it going to help us do? So it might be about working together with your director of fundraising to grow a digital fundraising stream, for example. What we want to do, having surfaced some of those challenges and begun to identify them, we want to think a bit about, well, where could you potentially go from here? And those of you who have come to sessions I've been involved in before will know that I'm a big fan of how might we question. So beginning to think about, now we've identified what the issue is, let's have a think about what we could then do to move this forward. Now, you may not necessarily have an idea of the solution at this stage, and the idea of this exercise is that the answers you come up with aren't too broad, aren't too narrow, don't necessarily box you into anything at this point. But it's really about opening the door and beginning to think about, well, where could we go with this? Even this sounds really difficult. What could we begin to do here to begin to make some steps forward in this area? So this is something that you might have seen before. It's an D resource which is out there, I think, quite widely, where you can begin to get an idea of kind of personality types, really. So really, red is kind of your classic kind of leader. Obviously, leaders come in all kinds of forms, and then people who are in the blue and green categories tend to be perhaps a bit more in the introvert category, which I really relate to, being an introvert myself. What can just be quite helpful is to think about roughly, if you've got certain key stakeholders you really need to influence, where they might be on this chart, and then also how they respond when they face conflict. So I was talking to someone earlier in an organisation where they are in one part of this framework, but actually if they face conflict, they end up in another. So it can be useful to think about yourself, where you'll be on this, but also where some of these key senior stakeholders might be as well. And again, I think this comes back to really defining where people are at, so that you can then develop some techniques to influence them.
So tip number one is to really try and get to know your stakeholders and try and think what their needs are too. So it's obviously ideal if you can have one-to-one time with them. That in some ways that answers there's another way of answering the question that Rob had around sort of people's fear of losing face. If you can have that initial conversation with them, they'll probably feel they can speak openly, and they don't need to feel so embarrassed. Or they might sort of admit to you as more of a digital expert that there's certain things they're not sure about, or that they're concerned about. So if you can't do that directly one-to-one, then a good tip from my colleague Mel is also sending a short questionnaire ahead of time. So before you do any kind of group work of any kind, send a short questionnaire ahead of time so you can get their very sort of individual personal thoughts and feedback, and then that sort of saves people being too influenced or too sort of fearful if they're in a group setting and they don't necessarily want to pipe up with their ideas, or if they feel they might be more influenced by the people's opinions. And it also helps you to sort of reframe things on an individual basis as well. So when you're doing that reframing, you can really make it quite bespoke for each person that you're talking to. Make sure all of the project team and the people who are involved in getting the work done are on the same page and consistent, and actually especially extend that to any kind of external suppliers and partners that you're working with. Because if you agree more of a unified approach, I'd say that definitely applies just as much as external as internal colleagues. So with Heidi's point about sort of about language and using the right language, I actually once got a supplier to present a product to my director and some of the team, and kind of out of nowhere they just started using loads of business jargon and sort of just terms that were just really at odds with our kind of tone of voice, and it really put my director off, especially because she was in charge of the charity's tone of voice and trying to go for a really sort of jargon-free human tone of voice. So top tip would be make sure you run through presentations and reports and things like that with suppliers or people who are sort of outside your organisation before they present that to stakeholders, just to make sure that you're all in sync and you're using the right language. You've got the right focus as well, so that you're definitely focusing on the things that you know that stakeholder is going to be most interested in and concerned about, and also just so that it actually resonates with what your stakeholder needs and you're kind of not wasting their time.